Welcome to God at Work, Stories of Grace and Faith. I'm your host, Chuck Groover, and it's that time of month again, beginning of the month, and I'm going to kind of switch things up a bit. I'm going to go into the unscripted part first, and then after that, I will kind of give you an overview of what I'll be talking about for the Bible study and the history portion of the month. And for the unscripted portion, basically, I was recently asked the question of if, when I get married, if I would be willing to attend a different church from the one that my wife would want to attend. And the reason that the person was asking me this was because they knew of two couples actually that were kind of facing this issue where for some reason or another the wife felt like she wasn't being spiritually fed at the current church that they were attending. One, the husband, a strong Christian, was comfortable where they were going and wasn't wanting to change churches. The other one, the husband wasn't quite as spiritually mature as the wife. But with that question, I kind of realized, or when I was thinking about the question, I was focusing more on what appeared to be kind of an unasked question within the question. But, and the odd thing is actually as I was thinking about the response to the question and this unasked question, the unasked question I actually answered wasn't even the one I originally was thinking about. And I'm not even sure if either unasked question were questions that the person asking me actually intended on asking or even realized was being unasked but still asked. But God in His sovereignty actually used this question to really help me understand the unasked question that I ended up answering in another light, because this is actually a question that I'd been pondering for a while for myself, and that question basically is, what are my views regarding being the spiritual head of my family? So, what does it mean to be the spiritual head of your family? Now, being that currently I'm single and I have never been married, as I said, I often reflect on this in order to really kind of prepare myself for when I do get married, because as a Christian, us men are called to be the spiritual leaders in our families. And I'm actually going to revisit this topic in the Bible study podcast I'm looking at starting at the beginning of the year. And I might revisit it again if I work through the book of Ephesians. And that's because if you look at carefully at what Paul states in Ephesians 5:22 through 6:4, where he's talking to basically first wives, then husbands, then children, and then the relationship between children and parents, he really says a lot more about the role that a husband and father is to really be playing as the spiritual leader in the family than how the wife is supposed to act or how the children are supposed to act. Because even when he's talking to the wives, he tells the wives to submit to their husbands, but then after he says that, it's almost telling the husbands of why, by claiming that the husbands are the head of the house, much like Christ is the head of the church type thing. But that's more of a call to action to the husbands to be more like Christ, And then right after that, he goes in to tell husbands to love their wives like the church, like Christ loved the church. And then he tells the children to obey their parents, but then he goes on right after that into explaining what the parents need to do to properly raise their children. But one thing that came to mind as I actually looked at those verses, and I will say I've read through that passage I don't know how many times, and there are just 3 verses that kind of just stood out this time that I probably have, as I said, read over I don't know how many times, and it just never occurred to me, and I don't think it's really occurred to a lot of Christians. But in order to sum up everything, basically using a kind of a discussion between 2 characters, and it's not 2 specific characters. The author in this sci-fi series that I've read, actually it's a couple of different series by him, but they all fit together as one huge, gigantic series. But, and it's not just 2 characters, it's different characters, but it's almost the same discussion where one character would state something like first priority or first things first. And then the other one would respond right after that, feed the crew. You see, as I said, Paul pretty much sums up what it means to be the spiritual head of the house in Ephesians 5:28 through 30. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one has ever hated his own body, but he feeds it and takes care of it, just as Christ also does the church, for we are members of his body. Now then, I will say, part of what I'm going to get into next, probably a lot of men, some men at least, won't like to hear what I have to say. But, as I said, to me it was kind of an answer to one question I had for myself, and that regarding being the spiritual leaders in our family, and that is that we should submit ourselves to serving the spiritual needs of our family. Or in other words, we serve as the spiritual leaders in our homes by tending to the spiritual needs of those under us, by making sure that they're being adequately fed. What that means, and an answer to kind of the question that the person did ask, was that, first of all, I would hope that it wouldn't come to that I would have to attend a different church than my wife. But if a situation came up where she wasn't being fed at the church that we were attending, the first thing I would do is, in prayer, I would go to God to see what he would be leading me to do. Because either there might be some, if she's not being adequately fed there might be some flags that I may have missed that could indicate that I might need to personally leave that congregation as well. Also, it just could be God's way of trying to get me to move to a different congregation, not because of anything wrong with the current one, but because in God's timing, he is wanting me someplace else. He's done that through other circumstances with me in the past, by having me physically move from one place to another, which resulted in me basically switching churches. I mean, the church I currently attend, I was attending at one point under a different pastor, ended up moving away where it was a bit much of a drive for me to go there on Sundays and serve like I was, so I went to a different church for 3 years. During that 3 years, there was a change in pastoral leadership, and I think God was wanting me out of that church when that change of leadership happened for some reason. But also, as I went back, the change of leadership also allowed me more of an opportunity to serve in other ways in that church than what I was currently serving. But the reason why I say that this concept of basically submitting ourselves to serving the spiritual needs of our family was an answer to kind of a question of mine is I'm not a dominant personality. I'm probably some would say I'm more of a meek or submissive personality, and so oftentimes I would ask, how could someone with a personality like mine actually be the spiritual leader in their home, like I'm called to be? And through this question and kind of my answering of it and further looking into it, as I said, I came up with that answer before I even looked at the whole Ephesians 5 thing, and that just kind of confirmed what I think God was trying to show me through this question. And I actually, because I had asked them permission if I could actually use that question to start off this discussion, I actually mentioned that to them, that I think God used their question to kind of show me what I'd been trying to realize about being a spiritual leader in my family. With my basically with my type of personality, and because a lot of people think, okay, someone who's more of the submissive type isn't really going to be a leader, but our example is to be Christ, and I mean, yeah, we can try and use him as the example of his future, of a second coming that's yet to come, where he's going to be the conquering king. He's going to be a dominant person. But the only actual example we fully have that we can actually look at to see what it is like is what we have in the Bible. And that is actually an example of submission. He came and was submissive first to the will of the Father. He obeyed the Father's will, even though he was God. He is God and man, and then there's God the Father, and he basically countless times submitted. He could do nothing except for what the Father called him to do. He did nothing but the Father's will. And in part of that, through love, he actually submitted to serve the spiritual needs of those that came to him. I mean, again, right before this, Paul tells the husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. And oftentimes when we hear people preaching on it, they focus on wives submit to your husbands, for he is about the head of the house, basically head of the house, just as Christ is head of the church. Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. And oftentimes when we get to that part, the focus, or at least the focus I've always seen and think I've heard, has been Christ loved the church so much that he gave his life for it. the thing is if you even count into his resurrection, that's just 3 days out of 3 years that he spent loving the church. The rest of that 3 years, he was feeding the church. He was making sure that those who came to him were being spiritually fed, that they were spiritually growing, that they weren't left as baby Christians, or basically, he made sure that they were growing in their faith, growing closer to God, growing closer to him. So, as I end the unscripted, if you find yourself in a position where you are the spiritual leader in your family, whether you are a man, or I know, especially nowadays, there are situations where women are having to be the spiritual leader in their family, whether it's because, like in the case through the Bible where Paul talks about being unequally yoked, some of it's because the wife comes to faith in Christ and the husband is still an unbeliever. She basically needs to be the spiritual leader for their children. But also nowadays, with all the divorce, even widows and stuff, a lot of times women do end up being the only parent, the only authority figure in a household, to where they basically are just thrown into having to be the spiritual leader. So, regardless whether you're a man and fulfilling your role that God intended us to be as a spiritual leader, or again, if you're a woman who finds yourself kind of suddenly thrust into that position of needing to be the spiritual leader in your family, just remember, first things first, feed the crew. And now, to kind of go into what I plan on talking about the rest of the month, as far as the history, from one of my sisters, she was looking at kind of a little, I'd say it's like a trifold size pamphlet, but it wasn't a pamphlet because it was just one side each, but it was about the size of one of those trifold pamphlets, print, that one side had a prayer on it, the other side had kind of a prayer from Francis of Assisi. So I'm actually looking into his life. I'm not sure if it's going to just be this month or if it's going to be another multi-parter, but basically I'll look into the life of Francis of Assisi, and then for the Bible study portion, we're again continuing on. I've got two more messages out of the Radical series, and this month we will look at not just a individual, but more of a church that exhibited what a radical faith really was. So, this is Chuck Groover again, and that is God at Work. Thank you for listening to God at Work, Stories of Grace and Faith. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at God at Work Podcast. If you have comments, suggestions, or a story you would like to be considered for the podcast, you can email us at stories@godatworkpodcast.com. If you enjoy this podcast and want to help support us, go to patreon.com/God at Work podcast, or you can also support us by leaving us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. God at Work, Stories of Grace and Faith is brought to you by Becoming God's Man Ministries and is recorded and produced by me, Chuck Groover. Theme music for God at Work is by the band 39 Stripes and can be found at facebook.com/39stripes. And again, thank you for listening.